So, there are a couple unique units now available in EU4, and it's time to rank them in the only objective way possible, a tier list. I will not be including mercenary regiments in this list, only regiments that can be built, almost like in the old Merc system before the rework, so can be built one at a time and integrated into standard armies. Furthermore, I will not be ranking how difficult it is to obtain them. To be clear, I mean how hard it is to enable them, not how many you can have as a nation. So if you are restricted to having, say, 3 of these guys at a time, that is going to be included. But if the restriction is going to be this tag or complete this mission, well, I'm going to be assuming that you have them enabled. Furthermore, with some of these units, there is an unintentional consequence of design where they are part of an exploit necessary to get literally infinite manpower. I'm aware of its existence, but I'm also going to assume you're not going to be using the exploit. Anyway, enough talking, but before we do begin, the usual things to be appreciated. A like on the video would be great if you haven't already, and a subscription would be amazing. But enough self-shilling, let's begin with banners. These guys are good. I think there's very little things to talk around here apart from them just being quite nice. They spawn immediately when you recruit them. They come out with 5 discipline and minus 50% land maintenance when you have a round. The 5 discipline is quite good for actually fighting. It's a pretty significant military buff. I think the main issue with them is not having a lot of them available initially. You get 1 for every 16 development rounded down. That does mean that as you get more development, as you get more land of your primary culture, you'll get more of them, but that kind of encourages culture conversion, which is a bit of a weird play. With that said, their main drawback, and they do have a drawback, is their reinforcement speed decrease of 50%. I think it's fine. They're just very good is the best way of putting it, especially in prolonged fighting, because the land maintenance means they're cheaper to maintain a lot of them. The manpower reinforcement cost of them decreased by 75%, meaning that even if you take 100k casualties, you're effectively only taking 25k casualties because if they're banner regiments. And of course they have that extra 5 discipline, meaning that they are dealing more damage and staying in the battles longer, so they are just quite good in that regard. Now, the main drawback, the reinforcement speed, does mean that again in prolonged fighting you are good because you're taking less manpower, but there's almost counterplay to that, where if the opponent sees that your banners are down low, they can start taking fights more aggressively against you because they'll recover from the battles faster than you are, and so it's a way to punish you almost for being heavily banner reliant, but it's something you can counterplay against with good fort placements and just in general good positioning and good recovery, so it's not too bad. The corruption cost of them isn't that bad. It does kind of add up if you're getting a lot of them, but corruption can be rooted out, so it's not the worst thing in the world. Weirdly enough, it encourages, and I'm just going to say it, to go Sunni with banners, because you can pop down -2 corruption, so you can hire literally like 20 banners and then just get no corruption effects from it. But I mean, overall, they are just really strong, especially putting out the 5 discipline goes up. Way the manpower recovery means they stay in the battles longer. The reinforcement speed can also be somewhat overcome if you take the 8 banners reform for 33% reinforcement speed and -10 land attrition on your banners. The land attrition helps you save even more manpower, although weirdly enough, the land attrition is deceptive there because you'd think that it means that you're saving 10% more manpower. You're saving like 10% manpower from attrition, kind of, but bear in mind your manpower reinforcement cost is already reduced by 75%. So if you were to take 100 damage from attrition, and you would instead take 90, that's true. But instead of you're reducing that less, if that makes sense, because that 90 to reinforce you doesn't cost you 90, it costs you 90% of 75, so it's a bit less. But either way, it's still really nice, and the reinforcement speed 33% almost overcomes the -50% reinforcement speed. It does mean that you reinforce 87 a tick, not 100. So it kind of knocks you up to 12 months you need instead of 10 to fully reinforce your units. Not the end of the world, but I think with something like banners, I would genuinely recommend defensive ideas or things to that effect that can increase your reinforcement speed so you're not that reliant on them. But I think they're really an excellent unit and should be used as much as possible. The main limitation is, of course, you don't get to too many of them, but as the game keeps going on, well, after each age from the Age of Discovery gives you an extra 50%, so if you make it into the Age of Revolutions, you're running 150% possible banners. So most of the time you're running at least 50 to 100% extra banners. In the Age of Abs, you're also running 150% if you're Qing or Manchu, because you get the age ability, so you're running a lot of banners. You shouldn't be too worried about it. But that's about that. I mean, yeah, there's very little relatively to say about them. They're just very, very good. And I know they have that drawback, but despite that, I still think banners are a pretty easy S tier in this regard. They still have a drawback, but I think it can be played around and almost makes it fair in multiplayer if someone is playing into you. And in single player, I mean, again, This is kind of a combined ranking, but in single player, they are still just very nice to have in both cases. This extra quality and the AI can't exactly punish your low reinforcement speed, I find. But with that said, we move on to the Carolinians. That's the Swedish chaps. Their default buffs are quite interesting. They get 5% extra morale damage, and they get 20-25% regiment drill loss, meaning that if you build around regiment drill loss anyway, you can get them to basically have 0% regiment drill loss, so you can maintain relatively high drill on them. And by relatively, I mean basically have them at 100% drill loss. The big one though with them is that if you are playing with them, you should probably take the nobility privilege for Carolinian March and minus 20 morale damage received by the Carolinians. That makes them quite good in their main purpose as infantry to, well, hold the line, because they are gonna not break. Be careful with that though, just because they're not breaking morale-wise doesn't mean they're not breaking physically. They are, unlike discipline, that doesn't mean that they're just gonna keep taking damage there, so do be careful with that. You can also pick up Carolinian Charge to get shock damage from them. The issue is they're infantry. Trying to get shock damage out of infantry is a bit of a... I mean, you can, don't get me wrong, but, be aware it's not exactly an easy task. So there we go. It's, again, much like banners, they're limited to Swedish, Finnish, and Norse cultural development for the most part. So, it's not too easy to get a lot of them, but if you work around culture conversions and that kind of thing, you can get a decent chunk of these guys out, and it's per 10 dev, so it's not that bad. It's, yeah, I mean, bear in mind as well, is that making them a lot stronger with the Carolinian March and Carolinian Charge does decrease their percentage amount available by 10% each time, so something to very much bear in mind. But I think, for example, the morale damage received is probably worth it. The shock damage, With the drill loss, I think the Carolinians are pretty good at holding the line. Beyond that, don't expect them to win battles for you. You're still going to be reliant on, well, artillery. And it's Sweden. You get a lot of infantry buffs anyway, so you're not exactly going to be, they're not going to be weak units, is what I will say. For that said, though, well, I say Sweden, you can get them for, well, the Swedish mission. But I believe that actually, I think it's only the Swedish mission. I thought maybe the Scandinavian can get them. Regardless, I'm not looking at how you can get them. With that said, they are, regardless, as I was saying, sorry, they're a bit of a weird spot where you have to kind of also play around the fact that you're probably playing Sweden on something with 20% infantry compatibility. That makes them shine even more. But as units on their own, their main purpose is holding the line. They do that reasonably well, but not anything too exceptional. So for me, I think B tier is pretty reasonable for them. They kind of can make an argument for A tier, but the issue is they're not even exceptionally good at holding the line because they do still keel over and die relatively reasonably. Their main thing is, well, a small amount of buffs, and I don't think they do their job quite badly in that regard, so yeah, we'll go with that. Anyway, with that said, we move on to the Kawa. These are the Ethiopian, unique units. Again, only infantry, much like our Carolinians. They come out of the gate with 5% shock damage received. Well, minus 5% shock damage received. We'll get to plus potential ones later. That's not a great buff. The main thing, however, is the land attrition reduction of 50% in reinforced speed. If you ever are going to leave a stack in the middle of the Siberian wastelands, then this is probably going to be ideally a stack of Kawa, because minus 50% land attrition doesn't mean that if, they would... that gets applied basically post-attrition. So if they were to take 4% attrition, that would get knocked down to 2%. What that does mean, if you stack land attrition, it's quite easy to stack it with Kawa units. For example, by going quantity, you can pretty much ignore attrition by taking 83% less of it. Of course, you still shouldn't take it for no reason, but it can be very much mitigated. And that can be quite good because it allows you to stack a lot of your units on the same tile. For example, for reinforcements in multiplayer, and in single player it means that you don't need to focus on that much on microing attrition as much as you would normally be. The reinforced speed on them is also really, really nice. It means that you can basically overcome a lot of battles that if they do go into, even if you lose battles, you can recover faster, so you can punish armies that haven't recovered by, by slamming into them again because you've recovered and they haven't. So I think that's quite good, and I tend to value reinforcement speed quite a lot. But that's a very multiplayer mindset. In single player, I think they're a bit weaker. Their main thing is quality of life of not having to worry about land attrition and the shock damage received on them. You can get a decent chunk of these guys for the record as well. It's basically fully core development, and you get 0.125 for each point of it, so you can get a lot of it. And if you start going into things like the Solomonic Empire from the government reform, 100% Kawa units just pretty much doubles the amount that you have. I mean, what else is there to be said? You can get a lot of these. These are kind of like, I think lore-wise, or I guess lore-wise it's real-life history. Setting-wise, they're kind of draftees, like think CK2 levy system, for lack of a better word. in terms of their armies. So in that regard, it does make sense we get a lot of them and why they reinforce quite quickly. But yeah. Army quality of them is a weird one though, because again, when it comes to modifying them with Ethiopia, you do have options for it. So it's again, we're assuming you're playing Ethiopia, you can get 10% fire damage received on them, which is quite nice. Does combine quite well with the shock damage received and kind of fits their function of sitting around as infantry and letting your cannons do the damage. Again, fire damage received and shock damage received I value quite highly. Unfortunately, it's only 5 and I mean up to 10%. 10% fire damage received though is good, don't get me wrong, especially because fire damage is what's going to be hurting you in the late game. With the Train the Cavalry mission, you can pick up -15 land maintenance modifier, which does add up over time, especially in single player when you're going to have a lot of armies and a lot of units, and in multiplayer when you're going to be spending a lot of money on your troops. However, army drill gain as opposed to drill loss isn't that great, because the only time you're really drilling is at peace, and normally when you're drilling at peace you have enough time to drill to full anyway. Rebel suppression efficiency is just build 25% more of them, right? I mean, it's kind of whatever. The assign the Kawa Conquerors one is quite a bit nicer. 10% recover army morale speed is a bit like the reinforced speed, helps you recover quite a bit, and that's quite good as well, because 10% recover army morale speed doesn't mean that you recover 10% faster. It means that you recover, instead of recovering say 15%, you recover 25, so it's actually quite a substantial increase if you're not stacking for it. And if you are stacking for it, well, congratulations, here's a big modifier that you're stacking for. The reinforcement cost does tend to hurt a bit. Thankfully, it's just money reinforcement cost. It doesn't mean that you disappear 25% of your manpower every time you're reinforcing with the assigned Kawa Conquerors. And the 2.5% discipline is, I mean, it's nice, don't get me wrong, but it's nothing too crazy. They're a very workhorse unit for me, the Kawa. They're not great, they're not amazing. They're just, I think, a pretty decent, like, unique unit in all things regard. Yeah, that's kind of, I think, the best way of putting it. The other special thing is they do cost mill points to recruit like Janissaries. And what's immediately nice with them is, unlike other mill point recruiting things, they spawn with 500 men instead of 10, which means you can also throw together an army of these guys pretty quickly when under pressure, and I think that's a good utility tool to have in your disposal. Overall, I don't think they quite scrape it into the A tier, but for me, they're pretty solid choices, especially if you build around them. Nothing too special. So I think I prefer them to the Karolinians, to be honest, but there we go. With that said, though, we move on to the Cossacks. Cossacks are an interesting one. You basically need the Cossacks estate. There's a decent chunk of ways of getting the Cossacks estate. I won't go into that here, but yeah, when you do, they're nice. They can be, weirdly enough, and I think this is something that people don't realize, you can have them as infantry. I'm not sure why you'd have them as infantry. Their whole thing is 15% shock damage bonus. That's kind of all you get on them. Which means you probably want them as cavalry, and you're kind of doing them in a cav kind of build. I guess it does mean that the Cossack estate isn't entirely useless if you're not running a cav build, but otherwise it's, yeah, they're a weird one. 15% shock damage is good on cavalry, and if you're doing for a cav build, they're good to make up for that, you know, they're good to get an extra buff, but they're nothing too special to call home about. You can also give them if you give the Cossacks the estate privilege to get Cossacks military service, you can press a decision to give them temporarily -10 land maintenance modifier, which is, I mean, it's something. The problem is it's not even permanent, and it's not going to save you that much money. It's cavalry, sure, but it's, you know, it's a temporary 10% land maintenance reduction. It's not the greatest thing that's ever happened to the modifiers. It's a weird one. I mean, it's not bad if you're building around cavalry and it's an extra cavalry buff to pick up. I just find that in a lot of cases, you're probably not building around cavalry unless you're doing a specific build like Poland or something like that, in which case you're probably not actually using them. Like if you're playing around Russia, you're probably using Streltsy a lot more than you're using Cossacks, and those guys are infantry. So you're unlikely to actually use Cossack cavalry, especially since you're not going to have 100% enforcement fraction, so you kind of end up having just a couple Cossacks in your regiment stacks. It's a weird one, and they're like, if you full commit cavalry, it's a nice extra buff to have. But if you don't full commit cavalry, they're a bit weird to use. So, as much as it pains me, I think, to be honest, and this is quite a competitive list, to be honest, I think they go into C tier, quite high C tier for what it mattered, but yeah, it's very specialized for them to be good, and even when it is specialized, they're only decent. They're okay, they're better than average, to be honest, but if you're highly specialized, they're just nice. Nothing too amazing. With that, though, we move on to the Janissaries. Who doesn't love the Janissaries? These things are honestly quite good. They start right away with -10% fire and shock damage received. They also get some assault fort ability, like they need that, because currently assaulting is pretty free, and they are even better at doing that. Army drill game modifier, I've already talked about being pretty useless, but hey, they have it if you care. The main thing, of course, is the reinforcement cost. They're expensive boys to have around, especially if you are in prolonged fighting. It does cost you quite a bit of money to, well, reinforce these guys, but it's on the end of the day when it does come to it, so just something to bear in mind. You want to be careful taking too many casualties on these guys, but at the same time, it's better to take loans than lose a battle. And I think with Janissaries, 10% fire and shock damage off the bat is quite good at that. There's a lot of things that can, well, modify these guys. Namely, you can get reinforcement cost right off the bat if you get the reformed Janissaries reform. There's also another reform for minus 20% reinforcement cost and 36% reinforcement speed if you want to kind of go for them like a mass thing, but you do lose the 10% shock and fire damage received. So if you want to just have loads of Janissaries out and about, then Loose and Devonshire system is the Janissary state approach you want to go for. However, I tend to, with the Janissaries, recommend a more quality over quantity approach. Even though you're going to have a lot of them, you will have a lot of them, just go for as many of these guys as you can get out. So I'd say go for your Ensure Discipline training and get the 2.5 Discipline on them on top. You can also grab Recruit by Merit and Ottoman Vanguards for another 10 morale damage and 10 combat ability. The 10 ICA does scale with Janissary Crown Lands, so do be careful with that. It's not like it's going to be, right off the bat. It's not as good as it seems, but it's not bad either. And the Professional Soldiers Regiment Drill Loss means they're kind of a combined Kawa and, Kawa and Carolinian unit. If you really want to be, it depends on how you want to play them. Quite good in that regard, and the Assault Fort ability is still nice because they are quite good at assaulting just about everything on the planet. They have suffered from power creep that used to be really amazing, and that, for example, one of their main things is that you can just burn 3 mil to just spawn 10% morale, 10% regiment strength guys like almost on the front line and have troops up and running very quickly. A lot of new, that's been kind of power creeped with a lot of new special units coming in, so I think they've fallen a bit behind now, but overall, with access to 2.5 discipline still and a whole bunch of pretty decent fire and shock damage buffs given to them, I still think they hold their own pretty well, and if you do build around them, they can be definitely very strong. So for me, I think they just about eke into A tier, but they're going to struggle going beyond that. Now, before we do get to the Musketeers, it's time to talk about Marines. I'm going to include them as the special units, even though pretty much everyone on the planet gets access to them. I think literally universally, it's a condition that everyone gets access to Marines. So, in terms of their unique abilities, is they don't take attrition at sea, which, I mean, okay, if you're transporting a lot of them, I guess at some point they can save you a bit of manpower. But that's the thing, they save you a lot of manpower because they use sailors instead of manpower. Pretty much every single country using Marines, and we'll get to the GB exception if you look, I split them up into two halves. The British Marines and normal Marines is going to be making significantly less sailors than they are manpower. Like, it's not even close. You're going to have like 100-to-1 ratios, if not more, of manpower to sailors available. So using sailors instead of manpower is actually kind of a bad thing, to be honest. They disembark faster, so you can land a bit better, which I guess is nice. And you ignore river crossing penalties, but you have plus 10 shock damage received. Not minus 10, plus 10 shock damage. So you kind of shatter to enemy shock quite a bit faster. So for most countries that can't really overcome the that England, you'll get to England to a bit, they can't really overcome the plus 10 shock damage. So these units are weaker. They take sailors, which are harder to get than manpower for most countries, and they have pretty useless buffs, because you know what else ignores crossing penalties? Having a higher maneuver on your general than, an enemy with, well, basically less maneuver. If you cross the river into someone and they have less maneuver than you, then your general, you don't take a crossing penalty, right? So in essence, you're just saying, okay, you never have to worry about that. It's equivalent to a couple extra maneuver pips, and that's being generous. Because maneuver pips also makes your troops move faster, this doesn't. And maneuver pips aren't exactly valued on generals. So you get pretty terrible buffs all around, and you get a pretty significant debuff with a 10 shock damage received. It's weird. Even in some cases like Portugal, which can generate a decent amount of sailors and can get extra 5 discipline on them, I would genuinely say with the plus 10 shock damage received, it's just not worth going for them. You're better off just running conventional troops instead, because you're never really using the buffs, then 10% shock damage received is going to sting pretty consistently. So for that reason, the normal Marines I'll be putting into D tier. Now let's talk about British Marines. Yeah, these guys are really good. So the thing is with, and this is more specifically England and Britain buffs, is that situationally within England, you tend to take maritime and naval because you're probably, when you're playing England, doing some LARP naval roleplay, which means that if you combine that with British Idea 7 for Britannia Rules the Waves, you can get 50% of your available force limit as Marines, and then maritime and naval both have 25%, so you can have 100% of your force limit as Marines. On top of that, you immediately overcome the +10 shock damage with your Royal Marines mission for -10 shock damage received, and you shove 5 discipline on them, which is already quite good. If you're playing England, well, I'd actually recommend, if you're super building for Marines, actually playing Portugal, popping the Portuguese mission for Clash of the Ottomans for 5 discipline to the end of the game, then forming England into GB for absolute monstrous Marines running out with 10 discipline. And that's the other thing with England, is that unlike a lot of quantity buffs that kind of nerfed a generation of sailors, with England, you can print sailors a lot more than everyone else can. You have obscene amounts of bonuses towards sailor recovery, sailor, well, generation. You're going to have a lot of sailors and you're not going to worry about that. In fact, most of the time with England, you're actually, if you're going maritime naval, which you probably should if you're building out Marines, you're probably going to end up with more sailors than you are going to have manpower. So that becomes a buff for you that you don't have to use your manpower. And you get a weird quality of life out of it, in that your cannons are still going to be, well, made out of manpower. So you kind of get that second effect of the second manpower pool, but that manpower pool is basically going to be purely for cannons. So you, unlike other countries that if they ran out of manpower, what's going to happen is they're not going to have the manpower to reinforce their cannons as well as their infantry. So they're not going to, if they keep fighting, yeah, they're going to just run out of back rows eventually. That is definitely an issue. The issue is that, well, I guess not the issue, with England specifically, you're not going to run into that problem. It's a very weird situation in that you have your manpower pool reserved for cannons and your sailors reserved for actually fighting. You run out with 10 disciplines, so they're going to be fighting really well. And the best part about this whole thing, of course, is amphibious specialization. If you take the Royal Marines government reform, which you should, means that your Marines take 20% regiment manpower usage, meaning that they're not only just 20% cheaper to build, they're also just 20% cheaper to reinforce. They're just, beautiful in that regard. So they stay in the battles longer, you're burning a lot less sailors for them. They're just really, really nice to have within the UK, and they're really, really strong because you don't get the shock damage and you run out with 10 disciplined Marines. Pretty beautiful, can't complain. And I mean, you also get the other embarkation and crossing penalties removed, but honestly, who really cares about that? There's other things you can do for England for your Marines as well, from what I remember, but, well, I know there are other things I forgot they are. But with that said, like Marines, they're absolute monsters in the UK when you build around them. Even if you don't go to the Portugal into England route, you can still have 5 discipline on something and basically an actual genuinely secondary sailor pool, because if you're going England and you've already gone maritime naval, you probably already rule the waves. No one can really contest you at that point already, so you don't need your sailors that much as you would need for land fighting. So yeah, Marines on England, especially if you do actually build around them, so do the Portugal into England trick, I think make it into S tier as well on that front alone. They're really good. What else is there to say? But with that said, we move on to the French Musketeers. And those guys were recently introduced, so they used to be basically a French age ability. You now just get these guys. They're infantry. They get to 15 land fire damage. It's not great. It's not awful, to be fair. An extra 15 land fire damage on infantry isn't like bad, but I find that it's almost a nerf to France, although France got buffed in many different ways, so it's not really a nerf in that update of domination. But with Musketeers, like the land fire damage that France got in the age ability was good because it affected the French cannons. Like infantry doesn't really do too much damage come late game, but it's still not something you should ignore, let's be clear here. So yeah, they're not great. It doesn't help the primary surface, it doesn't help the primary function of infantry to absorb damage. But the 15 land fire damage is a decent chunk of buffs to get to them, so they're not awful, and they're definitely not podding around with debuffs. It's in a very similar situation to the Cossacks, just weaker to be honest. So I think into C tier we go. To be clear, of course, you should still use them when something's in C tier here. I think to be absolutely clear on the rankings, right? You should still use these guys. It's just compared to the other special units, they're a lot weaker. But they're still better than literally no buffs. But there we go. With that said, we move on to the Rajputs. So these are basically, if you have the Rajput estates, so you're playing around India and have the conditions for the Rajput estates, not much more to say there. They have 5% morale. Great, what a buff. And they have drill loss as well and reinforcement cost. A lot of these guys, a lot of unique units have drill loss, which means that if you have access to a unique unit with drill loss, consider going for a regiment drill loss stacking build, because you're able to utilize 100% drill a lot more effectively then, because it's quite easy from what I remember. Well, I say quite easy, it's quite doable to get to something like 75%. It's the last 25% that's painful. But once you do get to that 100% regiment drill loss, it's quite doable to maintain 100% or near 100% drill on your army for quite a bit, and that's got quite a few good modifiers on it. Like, drill is good, so it's not awful to maintain there. They're a lot cheaper to reinforce as well, if so it can help in prolonged conflict, but in single player it's kind of a bit of whatever. It is what it is. You get a decent chunk of these guys, but not too much. It's force limit and total Reichsputz's force limit fraction, which is... So it's a percentage of your force limit for the basically, again, but you don't get too many percentage possibilities of it as an increase. You get 10% of the Reichsputz military leadership, which tends to enable it for most people. And also, if you have the established Reichsputz regiments of state privilege and you give the Reichsputz a lot of land, you can get a decent chunk of them from there, but it's not too great. I will have to say, though, that they do kind of jump up in viability a lot if you go to enlist the Purbuz and get the government reform Purbuz register, because you get 5 discipline on them, and that kind of bumps them up quite a bit, and an extra 10 fire damage. So they become quite nice in that regard. Picking up 5 morale and 5 discipline is definitely not bad. The reinforcement cost adds up, and hey, the fire damage still doesn't hurt. I think Reichsputz is definitely one of the nicer regiments to have. Shame you can't have that many of them, but the amount that you do have is certainly quite good. So with that said, it's a bit of a weird one. I think they do still quite make it into A tier because of the because if you build around them with the enlisted Purbuz and the Purbuz register, but at the same time, it's something you have to be consciously building around. You don't just walk into it right away. So there we go. There's not too much else to say there, and we move on to the Revolutionary Guard. So this is going to be a weird one because they're really good at regiment drill loss. Minus 50% means that it's quite good to maintain these guys at full drill. And much like the Janissaries, they're armed with minus 10 shock and fire damage. Thing is, though, they are just better than that. Because of the Revolutionary Guard trading decisions you can take. There's a couple options for them. You can go full Janissary route with a 2.5 discipline, but have 10% less of them out in the field and make them a lot more expensive. You can go full Vanguard to go minus 20% fire and shock damage received, which makes them really quite strong, and I would recommend that as an option for you to consider. You can go professional Revolutionary Guard training on them as well, and that gives you minus 25% regiment drill loss, meaning these guys lose 75% regiment drill loss passively on their own, so even a small buff to regiment drill loss means you can have like 100% drill on these guys quite consistently. And you can go mass Revolutionary Guard training for an extra 10% special unit force limit on them. That one I won't recommend because it's not 10% of your it's not 10% of your force limit that you get an extra. It's the amount that you're getting is then multiplied by 10%, so you don't get that many more out of them that way. I'd recommend either Vanguard or Elite to squeeze more out of them. But when you do squeeze out of them, they're quite good. They're very similar to Janissaries in the sense that they can be buffed in that sense quite well. And if you play around France as well, you can basically buff a lot of these. This is where I'd recommend Vanguard as well, because with France, they can get an extra minus 15 morale damage received if you go Revolutionary France, and that becomes an absolute monster with 20% fire and shock damage received and minus 15 morale damage received. These guys are going to stay in the fight forever, which is really, really strong. With professional Revolutionary Guard trainments, you can go to an almost meme levels of drilling them back really quickly and even getting a lot less land attrition on them, so you even lose less attrition, regiment drill from the land attrition, even. But it is what it is. And with France, though, the one thing I would say that if you are really building around it, it can be kind of a good way of staying in the battle longer, although I think the other options are better to go the Mass Revolution route for 15% regiment manpower usage on these guys if you go Mass Revolutionary Guard training. I wouldn't recommend it. I don't think it's worth it. It's a very committed, specific build to do for not that much output. Honestly, either go Vanguard Revolutionary Training or go Elite Revolution Guard Training, because Elite Revolution Guard Training with France puts them an extra 5% discipline, and 5% discipline, 10% fire and shock damage received units running around is quite strong and very hard to counteract with that regard. But yeah, I mean, I think in terms of pure quality, weirdly enough, I think you're probably better off going Vanguard Revolution Training, because an extra 2.5 discipline, an extra 5 discipline is like nice, but minus 15 morale damage and minus 10 fire and shock damage received is also really, really good. And you kind of overcome... You basically focus in the discipline almost in the parts where you want it, namely on fire and shock damage received reductions. So there we go. That's my suggestions for them. I think they definitely have a lot of really good potential in that regard. So for that reason, especially when you build around them, it's kind of a weird one for me because they have to be revolutionary, so they're quite late in the game. I have to mark them down for that, unlike the Janissaries that are available almost immediately. But when you do get them, they're really, really nice. I think if you could get these guys like day one, they'll be an S tier, but I'm going to have to knock them down to A simply because of relatively how late you get them. With that said, we move on to the Samurai. These guys used to have 10 discipline right off the bat, now it's down to 5, and it's still minus 10 morale damage was taken on them right off the bat. You can get a decent chunk of, of your force submit as them. So you can kind of build around them as well as Japan, and you should, they're good, but they did get nerfed and I'm quite sad. The other thing to bear in mind with them is the reinforcement cost as well can be quite painful and does start to add up. The wiki does lie. It claims you have plus 50% money reinforced cost. That is money and manpower as well. It's not just monetary reinforced cost. So it's kind of painful in that regard, so do be aware of that. They are, however, quite sturdy in the battle. Used to be a bit better with 10% discipline. Now, however, with that plus 5, it hurts. And there's not that many buffs you can give to them beyond that. It's 10 land fire damage at the end of the day, and hey, I mean, it's not awful. 10 morale damage and plus 5 discipline is certainly nice, and you should use it. It's just... honestly, kind of fell off to me, so I'm quite sad with how they've gone. Well, with that said, we still have to rank these guys, and I think just because of their relative collapse and that extra manpower reinforced cost, honestly, I'm going to be sliding them into B tier. They're still very good, but they're not quite as good as the other options, simply because you can't really stack too many modifiers on them. As for something like the Janissaries, for example, and you can't really customize them. And they can kind of bite you in the back with that manpower reinforced cost as well, eating up a lot more of your manpower in the process. But again, they're nice, and I would still recommend using them. Well, I'd recommend using pretty much all of these guys apart from Marines, to be honest. But with that said, we move on to the Streltsy. Well, they're a lot better because you can pretty much press the button to spawn them, and recruiting them does not cost manpower, which is really, really strong, for lack of a better word. So again, it's not like Russia needed a specific manpower buff in that regard, but yeah, recruiting these guys for no manpower is monstrous. They come out with 10% fire damage received, which is good because that's kind of what you want on your units, to be able to take less damage received. Specifically taking less damage, and they come up with 10 fire damage. Honestly, those specific buffs on them, they're not awful. Like, they're not great, but they're not awful. They're pretty mid of the pack. The thing is, you can get a lot of your full submit percentage as Streltsy if you're playing as Russia or playing around as Saddam as well. And the ability that you can just spawn these in with a button is really, really strong. It should not be, should not be underestimated. With that said, they are, you have to bear in mind that they are quite, unique in that regard, so... It's a weird one. Like, they're good because of the button press that can spawn them. But the other thing to bear in mind, and I think I have to mention with them, is there is a decent chunk of events. I mean, if we're marking down by events holding you back, I think the Janissaries have to be taken down a peg. I'm going to assume that you can manage the Janissaries, so you can manage the Streltsy. The reason I even bring up this discussion is I have been a couple times annoyed in that, like, I'm fighting a big war, I'm running out of manpower, I'm running out of men, and then my ruler dies, so the Streltsy demand payment. I'm like, this is a really bad time, guys, but, something to bear in mind. With that said, when you do play around with them, you can still give them quite a few more buffs. You can get them ICA if you're playing around as Tardoms, etc. Equipping them gives you, infantry combat ability as well, so you can get a decent amount of ICA and then actually make them decent at fighting their own. And the reinforcement speed you can get from establishing the Streltsy with government reforms as well is quite nice, as well as their reinforcement cost buffs to them. Basically, they are quite neat if you do build around them. Yeah. That's pretty much the best way of putting around the Streltsy. They're not anything too amazing. I think a large part of their power does come along from pressing the button. But as units out in the field, certainly better than infantry, but I can't really hold them anything higher than a B tier, to be honest. Probably slide them in between the samurai, and there we go. It's a pretty tough competition out in this tier list. With that said, though, we move on to the tercios. 30% shock damage received is good, especially in the early game. You're going to mitigate a lot of your shock damage received ability from it, and you can get more of these guys from high army tradition or with tercio companies and, you know, getting reforms and other fun stuff like that. You can also get the Spanish mission refined tercios for 25% reinforcement speed on them, which is quite good. That does knock you up to 125 instead of 100 reinforcement speed, which is pretty neat. It saves you a couple months in the process. What is that? If we have to do the math, let me just see. Can I do the math in my head? It's 8 months to reinforce instead of 10, so literally saves you 2 months worth of reinforcement. Can't from full, so can't complain there too much. The drill gain is whatever. I think the main thing is with the tercios that is quite convenient is they show up, they take that 30% shock damage received, and they just own it, to be honest. That's very nice. It does mean that they do fall off late game. They are quite weak to artillery, and they do suffer there. But it's a pretty respectable buff to have on their own. And because you can get them quite early, when shock damage is domineering, tercios can really run around and be absolute monsters. So that's just something to bear in mind. These guys are good. So there we go. With the tercios, though, I mean, I gave them a pretty nice endorsement. My issue, however, is their late game falling off and relative lack of customizability and buffs them. They're just a very convenient workhorse, and I think very convenient workhorses are B tiers. So there we go. With that said, though, we move on to Wind Hussars. +1 cav shock and 50 morale damage on cavalry is really overpowered. It's only mildly kept in check by the fact that you can't get a lot of these guys, but this is really strong. You can have these as the elite breakthrough units in your army, basically as Poland when you're playing around it, or Lithuania, Commonwealth. They're just good. They make your cavalry significantly better than normal cavalry. I mean, they're the Wind Hussars, right? There's Sabaton songs about them for a reason. These guys are absolute monsters. Yeah. Break the enemy very quickly, and even in very big fights, like they're great to have as an elite regiment that you send in, and also in very big, like a million versus million kind of player wars, they're also great because they can be the ones entering the battle first, starting to preemptively deal that morale damage, get the enemy knocked down pegs, and then as you reinforce more into the battles, like you can overcome their lack of numbers by just flooding in yourself while they've already been in the battle and done the damage. And because they've been in the battle first, they're going to be staying there for as long as possible. So they're going to get their money's worth basically by standing there. So they're good in pretty much all situations. +1 cow shock and 50 morale damage is massive in terms of their buffs. You do get 1 per 100 development. So I will say take the nobility privilege to sponsor the Hussars. And yeah, go accept more cultures to get more force limit, because you're going to need to, you're going to want a lot of these guys as much as possible, but there we go. They're quite painful to get. I think that's their main limitations, but dear lord, when you do get them, they're absolute monsters. There's no real question about them. They very easily just get into S tier, just go to the top there and sit there and be happy about it. With that said, though, we move on to the Kizilbash. One of our newest additions from Kings of Kings. Another buff to Persia like they needed it. Well, they don't even have a unique icon, so that's good to know. So I went with basically infantry and I shoved a little Persian flag. Same for the Mamluks, we'll get to them later. I went with horses and gave them a little flag. These guys can be infantry or cavalry, so it depends on what you're building around. That's quite convenient. They come in with -5 fire damage received and -25 land maintenance modifier. Honestly, it's not bad, but who really cares? And you can give them an extra 10 shock damage, but really, who cares? They're not going to make or break your game. It's not amazing. They're 30% cheaper with base recruitment costs, but really, who cares, right? It's a very probably the most balanced things that came out of the Kings of Kings Persia update as well, I will say, so good to know. But yeah, with that said and done, I mean, I think they make it into C tier and kind of sit there. Like, compared to every other unit there, at least they're not a negative looking at you Marines, but that's all I can really say about that. With the Kizbalash mentioned, though, we now move on to the Mamluks. Come out with some morale damage and reinforcement speed, and some army drill game modifier, some morale damage and reinforcement speed, can be cav and infantry depending on what you're building around. They're carried pretty much by one thing and one thing only, the Mamluk decision, and to be clear, you get these guys as the Mamluks for +5 discipline on them. That thing makes them pretty viable because it gives them +5 discipline. Well, what else is there to really say about that? That's good. It means that when you do build them or build around them in some, if that makes sense, like also for the record, you can get a decent chunk of your force limit as well, 20% of your force limit pretty easily as the Mamluks of, well, Mamluks. And if you modernize your Furusenia with the with that government reform, you can knock that up to 25%, plus any special force limit modifications you can have. So you can have a decent chunk of your army as these guys. Having +5 discipline on a decent chunk of your army is pretty nice. The morale damage is neat as well. That mostly applies, I find, to cavalry that can focus on breaking troops, but you know, also they can play about infantry. And the 33% reinforcement speed, well, is certainly quite good in multiplayer as well. For single player, it also means that you can overcome like battles. You can, you know, you can push the ER a bit more aggressively, save a couple months there. It's a very nice quality of life there. The 5 discipline never hurts. They're definitely a very nice workhorse thing, the Mamluks. I do quite like them, and I think they are, yeah, because of the how early you get them and how nice they are with that reform. A bit like the Tercius, you need a bit of work to get there, but it is what it is. It's definitely a very workhorse unit. So into pretty much middle of the pack B tier you go. But there it is, a relatively short and sweet tier list, so yeah, that's that. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next one. Goodbye.